Welcome back to Badass Woman 50 Plus. I am Robin Lane, psychotherapist, producer, director. This is a pro-age show, and as a woman of 86 years of age, what other kind of show could you be expecting? The mission of this show is to take the fear out of aging by being role models for women younger than ourselves. We offer relevant information on how to turn aging into a positive experience, and to that end, we also share our personal stories. Our hope is to inspire you to become your best personal self, which is our kind of a badass.
I am Natalie H. Rogers, MSW, CSW, actress, author, psychotherapist, and the founder of Talk Power, a panic clinic for public speaking workshops and Stop That Stutter. I am an age-mysterious lady, author of the book Talk Power, The Mind-Body Way to Speak Without Fear. On our show, Badass Women 50 Plus, although we are very serious about what we say, we also like to entertain. So, don't be surprised if you find yourself laughing right after a very, very serious and thoughtful moment.
Today's program will seriously digress from our usual format. This show has taken us out of our comfort zone of women's lifestyle issues and aging into the far broader arena of racism. America's history in this area is for the most part painful, ugly, and unresolved. And that is why it is back in the forefront. The deeper that Natalie and I have delved, the more that we have learned. Now, a badass woman can be of any color, but as Natalie and I are white women, the anti-racist muscle that we hope to help you bulk up on belongs to us white women. And I am sure that we all agree that a badass woman of any age, especially 50 plus, should be an anti-racist. But, as you will see, what that entails is a hell of a lot more complex than meets the eye. So let's begin with the backstory from our generation. Yeah? In the spring of 1963, Bobby Kennedy, who was considered a great liberal, met with renowned writer James Baldwin. Here is actor Leland Gant quoting him.
I remember when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said, "It is conceivable that in 40 years in America, we might have a Negro president." Now that sounded like a very emancipated statement to white people. But they were not in Harlem when that statement was first heard. They did not hear the laughter and bitterness and scorn with which that statement was received. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barber shop, Bobby Kennedy had only got here yesterday, and now he's already on his way to the presidency. We were here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president.
I grew up when in the South, segregation was the law of the land. Though in the North, we chose to be blind to it, life wasn't all that great for blacks here either. On August 28th, 1963, probably before most of you were born, I was at the March on Washington, excited to be listening to Dr. King. Now, at that march, there were lots of folks, and they were proselytizing from soapboxes. I was raised in a left-leaning family, but hearing black radical activists speaking so aggressively about economic parity and by any means necessary, it frightened me. It was alarming. The word black hadn't even entered our vocabulary. I was accustomed to soft-spoken Negroes. 3 years later, in a speech, Malcolm X would make that phrase a familiar part of popular culture. Black Lives Matter has shied away from by any means. But as a Jew, and living as long as I have at age 86, seeing all that I have seen in life, I look at things a lot differently. I wish that when the Germans began to demonize my people in 1933, that we had burnt Germany's cities to the ground. By any means, no sane person wants to get to that point, but not to understand the pain behind that phrase, well, that is not badass.
In Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, for much of America's history, racism was regarded as a black person's burden. Beyonce has remarked, "It's been said that racism is so American that when we protest racism, some assume we're protesting America." Implicit bias is always at play because all humans have biased inequity. That can occur simply through homogeneity.
You can bet your bottom dollar that the following psychological pattern will play out when any attempt is made to connect us white people with the system of racism. The first response is usually argumentative, where we point out the bad behavior of the minority culture. Our next defense is denial. If we can be in denial about the barriers that others face, then we don't have to see them, much less be motivated to do anything about it, and especially if they provide an advantage that works in our favor. This self-serving strategy is a dance that we all do some version of, to varying degrees.
Oh, Robin, I understand this all too well. I have my own shameful story to confess. I was friendly with a black neighbor. He had become the caretaker of his young grandson, who could not have been in better hands. Every morning, I would see him walking hand in hand with the boy to the elementary school. One day, I was stunned to hear that Jim had been carted off to jail because the child's white babysitter accused him of kidnapping her and keeping her against her will in his apartment. This could not have been true because the neighbors all saw him in the supermarket at the same time when she claimed to be captive. Jim was sentenced to 7 years in prison. We knew he couldn't be guilty. We also knew that whatever the problem she had with Jim, it would never have happened if he had been white. But none of us did a thing about it. To add to this, we never knew what happened to the boy, nor did we try to find out. I know now that our collective deaf, dumb, and blind passivity in the face of this horrific example of police and judicial malfeasance made us as culpable as the perpetrators. A good man and a friend lost his freedom as well as his grandson, and we were all complicit in making him another statistic. Back then, we thought, well, there wasn't anything we could do about it. Truth was, if we really cared enough, we could have gone to the newspapers. We could have set up a defense fund. We could have tried to involve the American Civil Liberties Union. None of the neighbors who knew what really happened were ever asked to testify. But neither did we make the effort to do this on our own. The truth was, no matter how liberal we thought we were just kidding ourselves. Not our problem. Oh, sure, we were against racism. We knew it was wrong to deny a person his constitutional rights on the basis of his skin color. We were part of the great body of self-satisfied liberals who thought the right thoughts and said the right words, but allowed an evil culture rife with unseen tragedies to grow in our own backyard. I'm telling this not asking for redemption, but because I'm trying to figure out how to go forward so as to never be complicit again, either directly or indirectly. I can no longer ask, what should I do? I can only ask, what shall I do? That for me is the great question of the day.
When I was 18, a girlfriend and I hitched across the country. It was a safe time. It was the early 50s, especially for girls like us. Anyhow, one night we wound up in a small town in Mississippi and nothing was open, so we wandered around and we finally came upon a large house with a beautiful porch and several comfy couches. And thinking nothing of it, we lay down and we went to sleep. And in the morning, a woman stood over us and we told her that we'd been traveling, we needed a place to sleep, and that her place looked great. She said, listen, y'all, you go get something to eat, and then you wire your parents for money so you don't continue to stay on private property. My servant will show you the way. The servant, a word that I'd only heard in British films, did so. And when we got to the cafe, we asked her to join us. Suddenly, she gave us a look of horror, and she fled. I'd grown up in Bed-Stuy, where whites lived on streets with trees and brownstone houses, and blacks lived on streets that ran under the shadow of the elevated train. We took that for granted. And one of my friends, the elegant dancer Arthur Mitchell, destined to found the Dance Theater of Harlem, told me about the problem that he was having trying to rent an apartment. On the phone, he'd be invited to see the place, and then when he would show up, they would take one look at him and they would say, sorry, rented. So I was not completely in the dark about the de facto apartheid of New York. Arthur was my friend. I was angry about the unfairness of it, but for a pretty white girl where doors readily opened, it was easy to put it out of my mind. Mississippi was another story. It was an in-your-face Jim Crow, white signs only everywhere. But instead of being more on the alert for racism in my hometown and in myself, the South actually made it easier for me not to be. I could comfortably split the nation into a them and an us. I could convince myself that because we didn't do what they did, we didn't have men in white hoods running around burning crosses on lawns, ergo, the South was bad and we were good. After the March on Washington, I thought, aren't I great? I have done my part, and for others. But 1 year later, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act outlawing the practices that many of the states had of restricting African Americans from voting, it finally dawned on me how truly personal this was. This directly affected me because in the final analysis, that restriction, well, it invalidated my vote. Now, in case you're thinking, what is this woman going on about? It's ancient history. Yeah? In spite of Johnson's efforts and because of the record black voting turnout that we saw in 2008, by 2010, 30 states introduced new voter suppression laws. And by 2016, 14 states had passed them.
When talking about police violence against blacks, the typical right response is, well, what about black on black crime? That is an apple and orange comparison. One thing has nothing to do with the other. The police are paid with taxpayer dollars to protect us, not to beat us up with batons. On the other hand, inner-city violence is a reaction to policies that support systemic racism. These policies in the form of laws are created by our governing body, the politicians we elect. From the president down to city council members, it's so important for all of us to recognize the ABC of this. Here's how it works. First comes a policy that creates an unjust and lopsided playing field. That in turn creates an explosive reaction of inner-city violence, which is the reaction to the policy. The real problem lies in the racist policies. In addition, studies prove that the explosive reactions are exploited by the media and stimulate passion and fear in white people. Moving forward, we will go on to show how by transferring the blame from these policies to people of color, we are blaming the victim. Here is actor Nelson Avedon quoting Fox News political commentator Chris Wallace.
As I looked into this, the numbers are just staggering. Shouldn't the African American community be focusing on black crime, the carnage in our inner cities, and not on George Zimmerman? When you have people demanding, let's go after George Zimmerman, hate crimes, and an economic boycott of Florida, these issues are not the real problems in our inner cities.
Last month, we celebrated Juneteenth. I wonder how many of us white people ever heard of this holiday prior to the recent demonstrations. June 19 marks the day in 1865 when 2 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, word finally reached Texas that slavery throughout the nation was abolished. The end of the Civil War was followed by generations of legalized racist policies, both South and North. This opened the door for the exploitation of black labor and the confiscation of homes, farms, businesses, wealth, black freedom, and the taking of countless black lives.
Get this, the average black family today has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family, a statistic that one might say is nothing short of criminal. Middle class white people, well, we like to think that we got where we are today by virtue of hard work, intelligence, pluck, and maybe even a little luck. We worked hard, we made it, why don't they? The playing field has never been level. Never been level. And it's beyond the scope of today's program to name all the policies that have created such inequality. But we can tell you what to look into. You won't have to go further back than a year after I was born, but that's pretty far back.
Okay, Robin, let's look at the landmark Social Security Act of 1935 and see how cleverly it excluded African Americans. Then take a look at the New Deal program and the Federal Housing Administration. See what it did for whites only, helping to generate much of the capital that many white families have today. In addition, the government set up appraisal systems for mortgages, where integrated communities were regarded as financial risks. So, when a black family moved into a community, the white homeowner saw his property as devalued, and out he moved. And since banks made it impossible for people who lived in an integrated neighborhood to get a loan, where do you think black folks could go to borrow? To this day, black applicants are still 60% less likely than whites to get a mortgage, even after controlling for employment and credit factors.
In 1968, Detroit had experienced riots that were among the most violent and destructive in U.S. history. The National Guard and the U.S. Army troops had been called into service, and the city was in a state of economic upheaval. The automobile industry had shed jobs and had moved out. Freeways and suburban amenities, they beckoned the middle class. Now, this collapse of the automobile industry eroded Detroit's vitality. There were vacant storefronts, urban blight, widespread unemployment, and naturally, despair. Now, in 1971, amidst this devastation, I was in Detroit acting in the Pulitzer Prize-winning play, No Place to Be Somebody, by the great black playwright Charles Gordon. It was in this setting that we performed to the most interactive audience that I have ever played to. My role was that of the white prostitute girlfriend of the protagonist, a poet given to long discourses on equality and civil rights. And throughout most of his soliloquy, the audience would erupt in cheers and applause. My character was largely met with hisses and boos. Now, being as vain as I was, this upset me. Now, in the past, audiences just loved me. They waited backstage for me to appear, but not so in Detroit. Now, I hate to admit it, but my first thought was, what's wrong with these people? Why don't they appreciate that I came all the way from New York City to entertain them? Forget that I was getting paid. Finally, after some Lady Bountiful soul-searching, I asked the director if I was doing something wrong. He sat me down, and he explained how, after the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, the same racial disparities existed, except now they were camouflaged by the patina of colorblindness. And That wasn't what I wanted to hear. I had convinced myself that things had changed. And as a white woman, why would I have any trouble believing that? This was the beginning of my education into how deeply entrenched systemic racism is, and what, as a white actress on that Detroit stage, I represented.
That was 50 years ago, Robin. Here's what's not changed. The black poverty rate of 21% is almost 3 times that of whites. It's unbelievable that for every $100 of white family wealth, black families hold $5.04. In the past, 20% of black families were headed by single women. Today, the percentage of black women heading families has jumped to 72% because black men are arrested at far greater rates than white men. If you've ever raised a child, you know the threat of "be good" or "when daddy comes home you'll be in real trouble" is a sure sign that dad still represents the ultimate authority. Absent fathers due to cruel and unjust incarceration rates leads to a complete lack of male supervision in the home, greater poverty and hopelessness. Every day, black men continue to be arrested for broken taillights, as well as repeatedly being arrested for no apparent reason. Did you know that black prisoners spend more time in jail for the same misdemeanors that whites commit? And more often than not, whites face little or no jail time at all. Federal sentences for the use or selling of crack cocaine, used more heavily by blacks, is unbelievably higher than sentences for powder cocaine, the drug of choice of whites. Get this, sentences are as much as 100 times more severe for blacks. Many times, bail for blacks is so high that before ever coming to trial, they languish in jail for years.
Back in the day, my choice of high was pot, as it was for many of my friends. We would smoke indoors, we'd smoke out on the street, we'd smoke wherever we could. And none of us were ever given a second glance. Now, do you think a black person sitting on the stoop smoking pot would not be questioned? Well, actually, the odds are that they would wind up going to prison. Just look up the statistics. Now, speaking of prisons, the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, a powerful not-for-profit group comprised mostly of male legislators and members of the private sector who draft legislation for distribution to state governments. ALEC has drafted the toughest sentencing laws on the books, like mandatory minimums for non-violent drug offenders and the 3 strikes you're out. And here's the twist. ALEC has also been very successful in creating private for-profit prisons. 2 of its private sector divisions, CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, and the GEO Group, are the largest private prison firms in the nation. And since the year 2000, private for-profit prisons have increased their incarceration rate by close to 50%. Yet the overall prison population has only increased by 9%.
Corporate sponsors spend a fortune lobbying to make cell phone usage punishable. What's wrong with cell phones? Well, if you can't use a cell phone, a phone call from a private prison phone is so exorbitant that it can cost as much as $10 to $17. Now, wouldn't you guess that corporate sponsors members of ALEC control 80% of all private prison phone companies, like Securus and Global, Telink? Bottom line, for the profit private prison phone systems, it's a $1.2 billion industry. You have to be pretty naive not to realize that somebody is making a hell of a buck on the back of blacks. I'll say it again. Prison business is big business.
Historian and scholar Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, makes it clear that any analysis that describes inferior outcomes for black Americans is racist. An anti-racist analysis would make clear that the problem is not that of black Americans, but the policies and put that racial group at a distinct disadvantage. He goes further in arguing that action must be taken if you want to call yourself an anti-racist.
If you refuse to send your child to a local public school, Robin, because the population is predominantly African American, that choice is racist. The anti-racist position would be to realize that if you don't enroll your child, it's your responsibility to learn about the inequality that affects that school.
Natalie, anti-racist is where being a badass comes in. Badass women, they're savvy. We know that for black and white folks to come together, the conversation that this country has never had must take place. Talking together about race is discomforting, but isn't it time that we got comfortable with the uncomfortable?
Well, Robin, I would feel uncomfortable, but I'd feel even more uncomfortable if I didn't say anything, as I kept quiet in the past. The time is now to speak out and take action.
Oh, yes, Natalie, how right you are. Look, throughout this program, we have been stressing how racism is still the driving force creating inequality and unfairness in every sector, whether it's politics, criminal justice, education, income, home ownership. And now that I personally have finally begun to ask some uncomfortable questions of my black girlfriends, they tell me about the humiliation and the disrespect that they experience on a regular basis. When it's time to vote, we have to make sure that we take a good, hard look at our candidate's history and know that she is an anti-racist. Because truth be told, none of us can any longer claim ourselves to be an anti-racist without doing something to help to level the playing field.
Well, Robin, we're coming to our close, so remember, we're on the last Tuesday of every month.
Before signing off, actress Chantel George will deliver And Still I Rise by Maya Angelou.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may try me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides. Just like hope springing high, still I rise.